I would like to extend my thanks to the Sure Foundation for the grant that they gave me in support of this project. With their funding, I was able to present this project at Phi Alpha Theta's biannual 2020 conference in San Antonio. I would also like to thank my mentor for this project, Dr. Eric Kurlander, Professor of History, who oversaw our senior research class and helped me guide this project to its completion. And I would also like to thank Dr. Paul Crochet, Professor of American Studies, who acted both as my second reader and as my student advisor during this semester. As you can see, the title of my project is The Paradox of Nostalgia for the American Indian, and the topic is how the heroic image of Native Americans emerged from a century of relocation, cultural warfare, and extermination, beginning in 1840 and ending around 1913. My research question for this project was, how did the noble image of the Native Americans that is still popular to this day originate in the 19th century, the same century in which the United States most severely stripped the native tribes of their ancestral lands, their freedoms, their sovereignty, and even going so far as to try to extinguish their culture? This spawned a couple of secondary questions that I hoped to answer during the course of my research. Firstly, was the proximity to the native populations the major reason for quicker or slower acceptance of the natives? Were the populations east of the Mississippi River quicker to show reverence to the natives because they were no longer near them? And then how did the portrayals of the Native Americans change or shift after relocation westward through the rest of the 19th century? Most of my sources for my historiography fell within two different camps in my mind. First, as an example, I have Donna J. Kessler's book, The Making of Sacagawea, a Euro-American Legend. And though Sacagawea's influence doesn't really pop up until after the period of my research, Donna J. Kessler's theories about her influence certainly do apply to the larger Native American community. She theorizes that America's unique myth-making culture in our attempt to create a distinct culture from Europe meant that the romanticization of the Native Americans was inevitable, since they are unique to our continent and our continent alone. And Sacagawea is a perfect example of this. So basically, we utilized the Native Americans as a unique trait for us, and it was inevitable that this would happen. And then I have sources from Robert M. Utley, Robert A. Williams, and Brian W. Dippy, all talking about the Indian frontier and relations between the United States and the native tribes. And they saw a bit more practical and economic approach to it, and that was America's westward expansion, our manifest destiny, saw the Native Americans as nothing but an obstacle in the way of our progress, and that the United States could only show positive sentiments towards them after they were no longer a threat to our society and after they were far enough away from us that we didn't really have to deal with them on a daily basis. And this is where we get into Eastern versus Western attitudes. Basically, whichever side was closest to the Native American population, they would have more problems having to fully accept them as part of our society rather than as a separate nation. As I mentioned before, my chronology spans from 1840 to 1913, but for a little background info, I also mentioned the Age of Romanticism in European literature from 1750 to 1800. During this time period, European authors had quite a fascination with the Native Americans and their culture, even referring to them as the ideal civilization, the idea of the yeoman farmer. This was mainly due to Europe being lost to urbanization and industrialization during this time period. But it is interesting that about a century before relocation, Europe had quite a fascination and quite a reverence for Native American culture, one that we did not have at the time. Then in 1840 is when all major Indian tribes had been moved west of the Mississippi River. And right away in 1840, we have several examples of positive portrayals of native culture in the East, specifically Washington, such as Pocahontas, noble, savage statuary, and publications on their culture. From 1861 to 65, we have the American Civil War, and during this time period, the five civilized tribes offered aid to the Union side, but this aid was rejected. Many Union soldiers did not like the idea of fighting side by side with who they saw as savages. I feel like this is an example of the United States showing fascination with Native American culture, but when there was a chance to actually interact with the Native Americans themselves, such as during the Civil War, we still rejected the idea and did not like the idea of actually having to interact with the native tribes. During this time, from 1860 to 1870, we also saw an increase in Indian raids in the Western Territory, specifically in Arizona, California, areas such as this. A major turning point was in 1876 with the Battle of Little Bighorn. General Custer's U.S. Army force was wiped out by an ambush led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and this really reignited the tensions between the United States and the Native Americans and really kicked off the Indian Wars again. Beginning in 1879 was boarding school programs for Native Americans on reservations, and this is really the beginning of the United States attempting to assimilate the Native Americans, and it was in many ways a cultural genocide, trying to wipe out the Native Americans' language, their old ways of life in many ways. And then in 1890 is the end of the frontier, with Sitting Bull being killed on his reservation and his followers panicking, scattering to Wounded Knee, where they were massacred by U.S. forces. And this was, to many, the end of the frontier, and it was certainly the end of the Indian Wars. And I also mentioned from 1883 to 1913 was the run of Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows. And these shows really gave Native Americans and Native American culture a real grip on the United States mainstream media at the time. And Buffalo Bill himself would eventually become an advocate for peace with the Native Americans and to show them respect. And the Wild West shows would really keep Native Americans in the mind of the American public and transfer them over to the next mode of popular entertainment, which would be television, where Native Americans would continue to have quite a grip on the American imagination. And on this slide, I just have a few examples of how, following the 1840 relocation west of the Mississippi River, publications and artists in the East, specifically in Washington, were very quick to depict Native Americans and specifically their icon Pocahontas in a very positive light and even celebrating their culture and their existence. We have on the left the baptism of Pocahontas, which was actually commissioned for the Capitol building, where it's still hangs today. And on the right, we have Pocahontas being the brand label for a chewing tobacco company. And it's very interesting how she is portrayed very positively in both aspects, although it is worth noting that she is decidedly more European in appearance than what she probably would have been during her actual life. Interestingly, following the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, a wave of pro-Indian activism swept across the eastern United States. This brief movement can be seen as a move away from just portraying Native culture in a more positive light to actual action on their behalf to protect Native rights. In 1877, the Ponca Indians were forced to leave their homeland and go to a reservation. This caused a public outcry as the move was seen as possibly being corrupt. An investigation into the Bureau of Indian Affairs confirmed these suspicions, and Commissioner John Q. Smith was dismissed. Thanks to this inquiry in 1881, the Ponca Indians were actually allowed to return to their homelands. The next year, the Indian Rights Association was formed. This group had a lot of political power for their time, and thanks to their support, Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce was allowed to speak with many top officials. Chief Joseph impressed him with his eloquence, and because of his efforts, some members of his tribe were allowed to return to their Idaho reservation instead of being forced to unsanitary Indian territory. While this brief movement of pro-Indian activism did accomplish a lot of great things, an article in the St. Louis Globe-Democrat summed up the era quite well. While Chief Joseph's campaign is impressive, unless action is taken on the natives' behalf, not much good will come of it, and the natives will still starve and suffer needlessly all the same. The Battle of Little Bighorn may have inspired some pro-Indian activism in the East with some positive benefits for the Native Americans. In the West, where the Native American population actually resided, it was a far different story. The battle inspired many United States citizens in California, Arizona, and Washington state to call for the total extermination of the Native American race. And as more and more local tribes had to flee from the US Army or angry settlers, Sitting Bull increasingly became the protector of many of these natives and an increasingly important figure for the Native American race. In 1885, though, Sitting Bull was actually able to tour with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show for a total of 4 months. This once again placed Sitting Bull and Native American culture in the spotlight of American media. Sitting Bull would quit the show, however, due to boredom. 5 years later, Sitting Bull would be killed by Sioux policemen. His followers panicked after his death and attempted to flee, but sadly they were massacred at the Battle of Wounded Knee. And that is how the Indian Wars ended and the frontier ended with the death of Sitting Bull. 20 years later, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show would also come to an end, though the glory days of the show were several decades before. This end of the frontier was a mortal blow to the attraction and the splendor of the frontier and what we refer to now as the Old West. As I mentioned earlier, the United States really wanted to create a distinct culture from Britain and Europe, and the frontier, the Wild West, and indirectly the Native Americans were a large part in creating this unique culture. But with the death of Buffalo Bill, the Battle of Wounded Knee, and the end of Native American resistance and their independence, all of this was gone. Theodore Roosevelt even mentioned how the Old West would never be revived again. The Old West was gone with lost Atlantis, gone to the Isle of Ghosts and of strange dead memories. In concluding my research project, I would have to begin by saying I agree to an extent with Donna J. Kessler and her theories on America's myth-making culture and the impact it had on our relation with the Native Americans. I can certainly see how our desire to create a distinct culture from those of Europe would lead to us associating so strongly with the Native Americans themselves and trying to tie them in with our nation's history and our founding, and most prevalently, with our trek westward and the Old West. However, I don't feel that this alone fully explains the paradox of our nation's desire to associate with them while also persecuting them so strongly and taking away their unique culture and their lands and even their independence. Similar to Great Britain, I feel that the American population simply could not take a genuine interest in native culture until they had either been moved far enough away from them or they were no longer seen as an obstacle to the United States' economic progress. This would explain why the portion of our nation east of the Mississippi was willing to positively portray native culture as early as 1840, and why the West could not genuinely solve this problem until the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. Tragically, while this history does mean that Native Americans to this day occupy a large portion of the American imagination, the impact it had on the native population itself was devastating. A large percentage of the native population was killed either through warfare, disease, starvation, or lack of supplies. And in the modern day, Native American culture and their languages are all but extinct thanks to the United States assimilation procedures. To this day, the Native American population remains largely forgotten and under the heel of the U.S. Army or totally dependent on the United States government to this day.